2,400 years ago, the Greek philosopher Plato introduced the world to the lost continent of Atlantis. His description of the ancient empire was so vivid and enticing, explorers began a search to find it and uncover its secrets. Author and anthropologist George Erickson has been looking for evidence of Atlantis in the Yucatan Peninsula and other parts of South America for the past 25 years.
This is the major temple, or templo, at Tulum.
He's not interested in finding remnants of the lost continent like so many others. He's looking for evidence of survivors. In the book he co-authored with Professor Ivar Zapp, Atlantis in America, Navigators of the Ancient World, Erickson argues that some Atlanteans survived the destruction of their continent and found refuge in South and Central America. Erickson's theory is based on his interpretation of Plato's clues and his own theory of where Atlantis was.
What's existing now that was part of Atlantis is the Yucatan Peninsula, except it would have extended another 150 miles to the north. Cuba, except it would be twice its present size. The Bahamas, except instead of many islands, you would have one great bank, the Bahamas Bank. 11,500 years ago, that entire area was above sea level.
The popular explanation for why Atlantis can't be found is that it was sunk 11,500 years ago by a massive earthquake that buried it under thousands of feet of water. But there's a growing theory among those who search for the lost continent that it was something much more devastating.
There was some sort of a massive disaster that occurred, probably involving a fragmenting comet, and it literally destroyed all the life, and it destroyed the evidence of civilization on all these islands.
This is the way both Erickson and the Littles, who've never met, believe Atlantis was destroyed. For days before the destruction, Atlanteans would have been watching the sky to guide them in their voyages around the world. What they saw was different than the usual stars, something much brighter. The animals would have been uneasy, sensing something. Suddenly, the sky filled with light. And then, destruction. In one day, the mighty empire of Atlantis was engulfed. While astronomers generally don't like to get involved in the topic of Atlantis, Dr. Mark Hammergren of the Adler Planetarium in Chicago agreed to talk about the likelihood of a comet destroying Atlantis.
When we look at the geological record, which is really pretty good, dating back to about 11,000 years ago, that's just the blink of an eye in geology, we find no evidence for a very large impact, something that could have devastated a small country.
Dr. Hammergren says it comes down to this. If Atlantis had been destroyed by an asteroid, there wouldn't have been any Atlanteans left to tell their grandchildren about it.
Well, see, this is a real problem with this Atlantis theory, that the impact was large enough to completely obliterate the island, to blast it so much off the face of the Earth that it is entirely beneath the sea now. How do you reconcile having an impact big enough to do that and still leave survivors who were anywhere around the line of sight?
George Erickson has a different theory. He believes there were a number of Atlanteans who not only survived, but left proof. The evidence, he says, is in Plato's writings, and here in the mysterious Mayan ruins of the Yucatan Peninsula, where he believes some surviving Atlanteans migrated after the destruction of their homeland. Erickson is convinced that these ruins were not originally built by Mayans, but Atlanteans. This, he says, is what the pyramids of Atlantis once looked like. He points to 4 key pieces of evidence to support his theory. Firstly, Mayan versus Atlantean building styles.
We have evidence that this has been built 5 different times. And they're not going to tear down this structure to go to the earlier ones, but each one may have been more perfect than the other or may have been less perfect. What we often find in the Mayan world is that the oldest structures are the most perfect. They're closer to the time of Atlantis.
Secondly, images of elephants on buildings. Plato said there were elephants on Atlantis. There were no elephants in Central America during the Mayan reign, 1,000 to 3,000 years ago.
Mainstream science has explained elephant figures like this as a stylized macaw, a parrot-like bird. But this is not a parrot-like figure. This is the trunk of an elephant.
Thirdly, sculptures of what appear to be men with mustaches.
Throughout the Mayan lands, we have examples of men with square jaws and with definite beards, often with accompanying mustaches. The Maya people did not have facial hair.
And finally, Buddhist and Negro sculptures in the ruins prove foreign travelers visited the Yucatan through Atlantis' navigational corridor.
Plato repeatedly described Atlantis as an island continent that connected the oceans to the other continents of the world. And this is exactly what the center of the Americas does.
But Gary Feynman, curator of the Department of Anthropology at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, believes what Erickson sees as proof of Atlantean survivors can be explained. The Mayans changed their style of building through the centuries. What look like sculptures of men with mustaches are Mayan supernatural figures. There is no conclusive proof of ancient foreigners in the Yucatan. And what look like elephant trunks are once again supernatural figures, this time with long noses.
If there is to be a radical reinterpretation of the Maya, then it seems to me that the burden of the evidence sits with those people who want to overturn decades of archaeological work and thought, and they ought to have a lot of evidence behind those opinions. And I just don't see it.
Scientists estimate that only 10% of the Yucatan ruins have been excavated. Temples still covered by centuries of foliage may hold other evidence to put the argument of who built these ruins to rest. But the mystery of Atlantis will continue. In the early 20th century, the Atlantis story became even more surreal and mysterious when a modern-day Nostradamus told the world he'd seen the lost continent in dreams, and he knew exactly where to find it. As if Plato's clues to the location of Atlantis weren't enough of a mystery, during the first half of the 20th century, another twist to the story surfaced. A modern-day visionary named Edgar Cayce told the world he had visions of the lost continent, and he knew exactly where to find it. He said the advanced civilization had mastered surgery with a laser beam, had ships that sailed in the air and underwater, created gases that allowed them to lift heavy stones to build temples, and had a powerful crystal that harnessed energy from the sun to provide Atlanteans with light, heat, and electricity. His vivid descriptions of the lost continent were spellbinding.
In the early 1920s, he had some people come to him who wanted to ask some other questions. They decided that if he was so accurate in being able to diagnose people from a distance, and if he had access to some deeper universal knowledge, that maybe he could tell more about philosophy or the creation of the world, or give a little bit more information.
To many people of the 1930s and 40s, Cayce was a modern-day Nostradamus. Cayce made hundreds of accurate predictions about the First and Second World Wars, the stock market crash, and India's independence. His prophecies about Atlantis are his most popular.